welcome to the Brufani. So we've got a panel today. This is on local news specifically. There's been a lot of discussion around local news already at the festival this year, and there will be more. There was some an hour ago, there'll be some immediately after this. And it seems that everyone has, much as sort of citizen engagement was a hot topic last year, suddenly everyone's wondering about local news. Acknowledging that there's a crisis and thinking about what the potential solutions might be. And what we have today is a panel of 4 funders, very, very different kinds of funders, but funders all of whom are sort of in some respect thinking about engaging with a wide range of different kinds of journalistic and information media, and thinking about the problems, particularly as they relate to democracy, transparency, quality of information. So I thought it'd be interesting to put them together and talk through some of the issues that they're encountering, that they're seeing, the way that they see the local news world from their different perspectives. Just to give a little bit of background, local news, we're going to talk, I think, mainly from US and Europe perspective today, although obviously, we're happy to kind of talk about other areas as our knowledge affords us. But there's sort of been a significant amount of research over the last 3-4 years, particularly looking at news deserts. There's even a sort of, there are sort of maps showing communities that are off the news radar, that don't have any local papers, any journalists covering any sorts of stories locally, no locally produced media. And the reason that this is a problem is obviously because that means there's no democratic scrutiny. It means that there is a lack of accountability and a lack of representation for local people in their local sphere. There are a variety of problems that kind of come in with news deserts, lack of local media, and so on. We're going to talk about some of those issues for why the crisis has come about, what the nature of that crisis is, and also where there are bright spots, where there are sort of approaches and innovations and attempts to try and spark methods of coverage, methods of sustaining local media that offer new vistas, new opportunities, hope for regeneration in some respect. So I want to start with I'm going to ask each of them to really talk about where they think the local news crisis is, what the nature of that crisis is, and to talk a bit about their own institutions initially and how they interact with that. And then after that, we'll move into a little bit of a broader discussion about some wider ranging issues, not just from their own institutional perspectives, but also from their own experience. They all have a wealth of experience from different kinds of settings. So I'm going to start with Nishant Lalwani from Omidyar network. Has also come, I think you were at the Global Innovation Fund for 4 years, before that, 5 years. So you've not come in from a traditional media background necessarily, but you have come in from the background of, setting up and running a fund, trying to spark different kinds of innovations, different kinds of new approaches and outlooks on familiar problems. So I was wondering what your perspective, first off, in just a couple of minutes, would be on the news crisis, local level.
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me? My background, as you said, is in investing in failing enterprises, and so media felt like the perfect transition. So I'm the director of investments of independent media at Omidyar Network, and we invest in investigative journalism. We invest in kind of for-profit models for news. We also invest in countering mis and disinformation and in press freedom, and we do that at both the local and a national level, depending on the context. But most of our investments, I'll be honest, have been national or international investments so far. I think the local news problem is oft cited as an economic problem, that market sizes aren't large enough to support media entities. But I actually think that's oversimplifying the issue. In my mind, the problem is one of not fulfilling, media organizations not fulfilling a full set of needs for citizens beyond, what traditional journalism filled when local news was more prevalent. So, obviously breaking news has become somewhat of a commodity, and people aren't really willing to pay for that anymore. And there's different ways of accessing that. That means that the substitute products at a national level or at a free level are more compelling. But in my mind, the advantage that you have as a local media outlet that you don't have as a national one is that you're able to engage your community and you're able to have a relationship with your community. And that's more about, it's more than just providing content. That's more than just providing information. That's a two-way conversation. And it's simply impossible for the New York Times to do that. Yet it is possible for someone like the Bristol Cable, who we've invested in, to do that because of their size, because of their local presence, because of their ability to engage. So I won't go on for very long, but I really think that the problem is one of redefining what the offering is in local news, rather than in just trying to make the economics work at a smaller level.
Thank you. So next we have Nienke Venema, who is the director of the Democracy and Media Foundation in Amsterdam. And although, we've talked a little bit about this, you're not making necessarily grants to lots of local media organizations, but you are thinking about how local media fit into exactly that sort of mandate of citizen engagement, democratic culture, democratic fabric within the Netherlands. So I was wondering how you're thinking about that dimension, that fabric.
Thank you, Samir, and also thank you for inviting me to this panel. When Samir did invite me, I felt a little bit like I have more questions than useful information to give to you, but perhaps that's not so bad, because, as you said, it's a buzzing theme at the moment, exactly because we're all trying to tackle it. So I'm the director of the Democracy and Media Foundation, which is a Dutch foundation, actually originates back in the Second World War, was founded by men who also started a resistance newspaper. And they felt very deeply that, just before the war ended actually, that after the war, the newspapers should have a not-for-profit owner. And that's where my foundation comes from. And they felt this, and therefore now, in 2018, we still invest in journalism and in media, not just for the sake of media and journalism, but for the sake of our society, our democratic society. So independent critical media, obviously a cornerstone, no need to preach to the choir. Local news becoming more and more challenging, also something that I guess everybody in the room is aware of. And if not, Nishant's already quite eloquently explained it. The way we feel about it is sort of twofold. Aside from the problem, which is that power in the Netherlands is increasingly decentralizing. So I'm sure this is the case in many other countries where, municipalities are increasingly responsible for distribution of wealth and for making local decisions, but there are increasingly fewer journalists that are holding truth to power. And the other sort of warning signal that we find is that, in a way, you can look at local news as the canary in the coal mine. The fact that it's so under pressure and perhaps even failing says something about the system. So this is how we look at it, and this is why we're trying to sort of tackle the bigger issue behind it. And what can funders do, really? So we can support local investigative journalism. We could support local projects. But we're thinking more about, in future years, supporting the infrastructure that facilitates good local journalism. So that could be training local journalists to be political journalists on a local level. I mean, it's a very particular kind of skill set. But it also, because that's also rather patronizing. I mean, journalists are generally quite good at what they do. Nevertheless, this seems to be one of the things that is asked for. And the other thing I feel is that we would like to we would like to facilitate local journalists to be able to collaborate and be autonomous and not be dependent on a very large and expensive infrastructure that often comes with a media company.
thank you. Now we're coming to Ludovic Blecher, who is the head of the Google Digital News Initiative Innovation Fund. And over the course of 2 and a bit years of the fund, you've had several thousand applications from news organizations across Europe. You cover the whole of Europe, more or less. And you're encountering a very, very wide range of news organizations, people who are interested in journalism at all sorts of levels. And one of the things that I think is interesting, and I should say that I worked for the fund for one of the rounds, so this is why I have a somewhat inside perspective, is that there is an ecosystem approach that you have been looking really not just at journalism organizations, but also a variety of different kinds of organizations that are involved in the journalism ecosystem, and without which journalists can't do their job, whether that's technology or lawyers or transparency groups or whatever. So I'm curious how you see this landscape, given the breadth of vision that you've got and the volume of applications you've received.
It works. So first, thanks for saying, because the fund is really broad and open. And we used to say, it's all about stimulation. That's why we want to think big, to open the door to any idea in order to stimulate innovation in news. The Digital News Innovation Fund is open to 32 European countries, and anyone that have idea for news, local player, broadcaster, traditional newspaper, even independent, can apply to the fund. And when you talk about crisis in local, and we try to define a landscape, actually it's very difficult. First, there is a real challenge, there are real opportunities also, and the situation is very different depending on countries. You talk about the US and Europe. How can you compare the situation in the US with local and Europe? That's really fragmented here. The market is very different. The size of the paper are very different. Plus, even within local, there are the local player, regional, hyper-local, online-only local. So many kind of different situations depending on countries, depending on size of groups, of the groups. What is true is that they are going through hard time, and the disruption in some way came after the disruption for more mainstream news. So it's something in some way more new, but with maybe a lot of, I would say, feature that you can leverage on. The community you talk about, the engagement, the in-depth relationship they're having with their audience, the archives, because they are here for a very long time, how all that stuff can be used in order to redefine the relationship and to reinvent the recipe, because the crisis is an economic crisis, of course. And in terms of journalism, in local, there is a lot to do, and I will talk about projects that we see through the eyes of the NI Fund that are absolutely amazing in all the topics, from artificial intelligence in order to reduce cost, from data and data management, data journalism in order to become the local watchdog, and there are a lot of opportunities in there. So I want also to see what's going on in terms of good news for the future.
Okay, thank you. That's a helpful, positive note. Molly de Aguiar, you run the News Integrity Initiative now, but you have a very, very deep history in dealing with place-based grant-making around media, around the needs of communities themselves in terms of information, and the diversity and variety of ways in which people are trying to meet those needs in the US. And so I wondered if you might take, from that perspective, inject that into the conversation.
Sure. Thank you for having me. I hear echoes of the work that I've done and everything that everybody has said so far, from reimagining the way that journalists have to work with the public and serve the public, from Nishant, talking about the importance of funding infrastructure, which is what we did in New Jersey. If I'm wearing my sort of old Dodge Foundation hat, before I was at the News Integrity Initiative, I was at a place-based foundation called the Geraldine R. Dodge Foundation in New Jersey, and we funded the infrastructure for local journalism, and we took an ecosystem approach by understanding like what are all of the news and information entities within an ecosystem, and how can we support a connected and collaborative ecosystem approach across a state? Can we demonstrate that that philanthropy can provide the support, the runway to strengthen the whole infrastructure of the ecosystem, rather than funding content or particular projects or whatever? Can we strengthen the whole system in order to allow them to do good work? And so, yes, I've done a lot of that work of really understanding what it looks like in a very local place. What does it look like? What do people want and need from news and information? And how can small digital sites be responsive to that? So one of the things that I just want to be clear about is one of the complexities of this conversation is, and you alluded to it, is we're talking about all different kinds of media, different sizes, different locations, and all of those things affect what the model might look like in that place, or what the needs of the community are in that place. And so from my perspective, I've worked most closely with very small digital sites, usually like 1 or 2 people, but upwards of maybe 5 or 10 people. I can't talk intelligently about what the New York Times should be doing, but I can share experiences about what it's like, what the daily challenges and opportunities are for very small local digital sites. All in there.
Well, where I wanted to go, actually, if we can stay with you for a little bit, is that dimension, which is what citizens want and need. Because I think that often doesn't, we talk a lot about what are the models, how are we going to sustain it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But really at the heart of it, and as Nienke put it, there's a democratic deficit, or, the sort of the decentralization of authority, but the corresponding lack of scrutiny, or the weakening of scrutiny at the local level. And Ludo, as you said, across Europe, that picture is very, very different. When you're looking in the UK or in France or in Denmark, that link, it's not necessarily threatening the fabric of democracy. It's weakening some aspects of participation, and it's certainly a cause for concern. But it's different from, for example, rural Romania, or in the Western Balkans, or where there are areas where there are genuine issues around safety for journalists, or corruption that is being sort of allowed to grow unchecked and without any scrutiny. So what is it that citizens themselves, in your experience, and actually then you can sort of roll back this way, what is that dimension?
Yeah. I think there are a lot of surprising similarities about what people say they want and need. One of the things that the News Integrity Initiative funds is a project called News Voices. And it's really, it's a lot like community organizing. It brings newsrooms, it brings journalists and members of the community, a good cross-section of a community together in a place to have like a town hall forum and really talk about what's on people's minds, what stories aren't being told, how people feel about whether or not their news and information needs are being met. And I've been to a lot of these, and the public says pretty much the same thing no matter where, granted in one state, not across the world. They say pretty much the same thing whether they are in an affluent town or not. They say they're very tired of all the crime and death reporting. the sensational news, anything that is, the business model that prioritizes clicks and traffic over their actual needs. They are tired of journalists parachuting into their communities and misquoting them, not really having the full context of what's happening in their communities. They talk about, at least in the US, they talk very much about the racism the inherent racism in the way that the stories are told, and the fact that you see on like local TV news in the U.S. constant mugshots of people of color, and they are frustrated that the journalism doesn't report about solutions. They want hope, they want solutions, and they don't get it, and they're very frustrated by that.
So I will check example exactly about solutions. And a local player in France, Nice Matin, came 2 years ago with exactly a solution approach. And they starting trying to build a subscription model, so it's both free and subscription, but they try really hard to leverage the subscription model on what they call impact and solution. So it was about providing context, but also about providing ways and resources to be helpful for the community. It has brought incredible results in terms of growing the number of subscribers in this paper. So this is one of the recipes that sounds work. What people want, it's always really hard to define, to understand, but I think there is really a need for context and to take, I would say, local stuff as seriously as the national one. They want investigation at local level. They want the local player to be the VG, the one that is really figuring out what's going on around, but also that can remind what has been missed, what has been done, what was promised and not done. So to look at the outcome of political engagement and stuff. So to take things very seriously.
Are we still on what people want?
Yeah.
Okay.
How do you know? I mean, and also how do you know?
What people want?
Yeah.
That's an existential question that you're posing there. What do we want? I like what Molly touched upon as well, is the criticism that comes from certain communities about the way that they're being represented in journalism currently. So you could talk about community journalism, but we're not talking about local journalism. I'm just saying, if anybody wants to talk about community journalism, I'd be up for that. That's interesting too. There's this research done in Norway. I forget who did it. Omidyar, I think it's called, Omidyar, about whether or not people are willing to pay for local journalism and when they are. Because Norway's actually doing, wow, I'm being loud, Norway's actually doing pretty well. So there's different countries have different situations when it comes to how well local media is doing. And Norway is one of these examples that did rather well. And they found there that people are actually willing to pay for quality local journalism. They're not willing to pay for clickbait or for gossips, though they do like clicking on it. So if you're depending on advertising revenue, that works too. But they are willing to pay for quality journalism. And I found that really hopeful. But then how to, as a funder, because we're talking from a funder's perspective and not necessarily from an expert's perspective, although you've ascribed lots of expertise to us. But as a funder, what do you do with this, with the fact that people are willing to pay for quality journalism, but how much are they willing to pay? And are they willing to subscribe? And when are they willing to pay? And how do you, well, anyway, so these are infrastructure questions again. An example, sticking with Ludo, hopeful examples, that Democratie and Media Foundation hasn't actually funded, but that I am stealing, just to give a good example, is the Bureau Local. I don't know if anybody's heard of that. It's a part of the Bureau of Investigative Journalism. And they just won the European Press Prize for Innovation. So that's how I came across them, because we're a part of the Press Prize. And what they did really well is they're just a bureau of 4 people who decided local news is important. And what they do is collaborative journalism. So they're a team of 4, but they work with 450 journalists and volunteers and local people that give input on which issues are important. And then they work with civic tech companies to do data journalism. And they, in the last couple of months that they've only existed, they've come up with breaking news with excellent reports. They've made the national news several times. I think there were some political consequences to the work they've done, and yet it's all local. So this is a really good example of where do funders come in. It's capitalizing on the fact that people are interested and they do think it's worth money and it's worth time, but you need to sort of help facilitate the infrastructure. By the way, I know you funded that, Ludo, so I'm aware of it.
I didn't say anything.
No, I know.
But they had huge impact.
Huge
in
impact.
very few time, also about refugees and so on.
Yeah. I mean, they reported on
Absolutely.
new election voters, wide-scale farming pollution, cuts to domestic violence, so a whole variety of issues that were important locally.
But we'll come, I think, in a second on to sort of more examples of models that you think are sort of prospering. But I think on Bureau, what's interesting particularly about that to me, and we can come back to this, is that it's almost like what the Panama Papers did on an international cross-border level, but within a country. Mm-hmm. And I think that's and it's taking that sort of commons-based collaborative pooling of resources to a national level in the national interest. It was a really interesting model which we can come back to. Nishant, on what?
Yeah, well, I guess the glib answer is that you should ask them, and they really want. I think they want a voice. They want a say in how their local news is done, how stories are chosen, why stories are chosen. On editorial strategy, and that's something which I think you can do at a local level, and it's much harder when your audience is a multi-millions. So I mentioned an example earlier, the Bristol Cable, which is continuing the UK theme, and they're a newspaper in Bristol, which is a city of about 400,000 in the UK, and they have a cooperative model. So their members actually own the newspaper, and they also pay on a monthly basis to actually receive the newspaper and have an online subscription as well. And they've had success so far with being able to engage their community, or the subset that show up for meetings and contribute online, in engaging what topics are important to them and where they're actually seeing stories that should be covered. So, for example, it was through that kind of conversation that there were issues raised around police surveillance of citizens using mobile phones, and the lack of oversight and the lack of discussion in the national papers about that. And the Bristol Cable did an investigation. It was turned out that policemen were actually getting access to mobile phones and surveillance without the same level of scrutiny that typically happens with the wiretap and so on. And that story went national, and Privacy International then published a report calling for policy changes on the issue. So there's a kind of virtuous cycle there, and because that issue really mattered to readers, they could spend their very limited resources on that investigative model. To Ludo's point, people do want scrutiny of how public resources are being spent and public policy, but as a local paper, you can't do that across the entire local government. So you can ask readers what they want and focus down to get stories that are relevant and matter to your audience.
Okay, so drilling into that, that's an interesting thing for a funder of the type of it's not necessarily Omidyar's past profile of to look at a cooperative. I ran a panel last year which was with cooperatives from the US, Egypt, Spain, and UK as well, and Belgium. And it is a very interesting model. Even through DNI, you funded some cooperatives as well. So I'm curious about that particular thing as a genre of sort of engage. What does that add to the ecosystem that perhaps wasn't being looked at by funders maybe 2-3 years ago, but is now emerging as what has matured in that particular space or in the environment that means that has a particular resonance or resilience?
Do you want me to take that? Yeah. So I think that we're clearly in time of trouble when it comes to local news. There aren't many success stories. And I think as philanthropic funders, it's our obligation to experiment and, as Ludo said, to stimulate. And so I think cooperatives are one of the many models that are, there's green shoots there. And no one's worked out, exactly how the economics will scale or sustain. But I do think that there's a proposition there that makes sense in theory, and even more importantly, there's value for an audience, for a community, and there's a tangible link into having a voice in the institution, a legal link into having a voice in the institution. So certainly, at Omidyar Network, we're very keen to see citizens have more empowerment, have a greater say in the decisions that affect their lives, not just in media, but in democracy. And for us, this is a very aligned approach in concept, an unproven approach, but one that we hope will generate some lessons for us over the coming years.
Just one thing, not really about cooperative, but about collaboration, which goes with the same kind of idea. Through the project, I'm really amazed to see how there is a kind of collaboration culture in local press, especially when it goes to tools and how they can come together to tackle technical challenges. This is something that can come maybe from printing press difficulties, where sometimes they were gathering to try to reduce cost. But we see a lot of collaborative projects. One is, for example, in Spain with NAO coming with many local publishers to try to gather the data together. We have in Portugal a single sign-on initiative done with national and local paper, which is absolutely unique. And there is also this culture of knowledge sharing. When someone finds a recipe, he is really willing to share with others through consortiums, through trade association and stuff. And they clearly see the competition, or we have a lot of local players that see the competition more in the way they are doing journalism rather than through technical approaches and technical difficulties. So they are willing to share this part and compete in journalism. That's pretty interesting as well.
Yeah. So one of the points I would make, I appreciate that about collaboration. One of the cautions I have about collaboration is it's great to have newsrooms collaborate more, but that doesn't necessarily lead to more trust with the public necessarily. It could just be collaboration for collaboration's sake. And I think going back to the point about cooperatives, I mean, we don't currently fund any cooperatives, but I am really a huge fan of the Bristol Cable and of the Ferret and others. I think they have trust built into their model, right? And I think a lot what we're talking about up here is how do we reimagine journalism that builds trust with its community, and how do you optimize? And I think Jay Rosen has a whole talk about, how do you, and a whole project about how do you optimize newsrooms for trust, and cooperatives I think are particularly well situated for building trust in really meaningful ways with the public, and they do have collaboration at the heart of them with the owners of the cooperative, but I always just try to make that distinction with collaboration, because it's good, but there might be a lot of traditional newsrooms who are doing very traditional things and also collaborating with one another, but they're not necessarily addressing the trust deficit with the public.
Well, I mean, I completely agree with what Molly just said, and an example that I could give on that, which you all know because it was like the cool startup on the block and now it's turning into a scale-up, but would be The Correspondent, which has really invested in a true membership model in which people that are readers can also become experts and can also therefore decide what's being reported on, what sort of the content of the platform is. And that's really important for trust. So I'm with you on that very much. What I also wanted to add is that it's just a thought I had. sorry to sort of change the topic a little bit, but it's that local is really a really big theme now, in part because of what happened in the United States with the Trump election, because all of a sudden everybody realized that journalists are reporting from these few cities on the east and west coast. They're not in touch with what's happening in the rest of the country, and therefore everybody was taken by surprise. So, in a way, the same happens in a very small scale in my very small country, the Netherlands, and I'm sure in other countries as well. And I would just plead that we don't just think about local news when elections are coming up or in terms of, upcoming elections, but that we seriously consider that there is a deficit here, that there is a very large part of society that's not being represented in media and that's not being given a voice and whose problems are not being addressed, and that this is actually very dangerous for our democratic society. And therefore we as funders, and I don't know if there are any other funders in the room, but should take this topic rather seriously and perhaps collaborate on it.
That's a perfect segue. So thank you for mind reading. That was, in a sense, what I wanted to come to now is exactly that. What has worked for you as funders, but also what is missing from that landscape, and particularly, is the scale of the response commensurate with the scale of the issue? We've seen, for example, from my experience looking, interviewing funders, working as a funder, there is a definite, I have a perception of a bias, let's say, towards more tangible, outcome-oriented types of journalism or initiative, perhaps fact-checking, investigative journalism, things that are visibly impact-focused or that lead to a particular outcome, that have a very, very clear relationship with accountability in some respect. But this stuff that's a little bit more intangible, a little bit more about relationship with communities, a little bit more about the fabric of society in a sense, is harder to work on, is longer term, requires a wider range of investments and more hands-on support for the people that you're actually working with sometimes. So I'm curious, what in that context, if you agree with that, two, what you think funders are already doing that is working, and what you think is missing. Anyone, feel free to.
Well, I'll just disagree with the premise a bit, in that I think it's pretty tangible what happens when you don't have quality local news. Your point about the reporters that are reporting on Trump. I'm sure a lot of people here saw the Sinclair piece in the US where they were given, just a show of hands, who saw that? Where they were given, many news stations were given exactly the same script and said it in exactly the same fashion to millions of their viewers. In the UK, 70% of local media is owned by either News Corp, the Daily Mail Trust, or the Trinity Mirror Group. So there's a huge impact on elections, and it is very, very tangible. And so I think that we've been a bit slow to wake up to this. We've thought of, I think, local news as a nice to have rather than as a must have. And now we're seeing the impact on a global scale of not having representation. A simple thing which I'll keep saying throughout this festival here in Perugia, and for the rest of the time I'm funding journalism, is that there aren't enough philanthropic funders in this space. There's really very, very few funders, especially outside the US, who are willing to engage in meaningful funding of independent media, allowing for editorial independence. There's even fewer that are willing to do it at a local level. And so if we as a community can use this crisis to bring in more high net worth individuals and impact investors and other funders who've typically funded health and education and things that maybe seem more tangible to new philanthropists, then I think that'll be an important first step.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with that more. I spend a lot of time thinking about how do we bring more funders into this space and help them understand that, they may think of themselves as an arts funder or a health or an environment funder, but an investment in news and information is an investment in all of the things that they care about. I think to add to your list of sort of what are some of the problems with the funding in this space is, the lack of patience, there's an aversion to risk, and so, I think it's hard to find the funders who are willing to take some risks and to fund some things that aren't well established and proven. They, as you said, they tend to want to promote their own agendas, their own goals. And media hasn't been historically a charitable endeavor, so that's another issue. So those are all issues that we have to grapple with. I think funders, one of the things that I have really noticed about funders who actually do fund media, they don't like to call themselves media funders. And I think there's some psychology behind that we have to dig into a little bit as well and understand, okay, so we won't call you a media funder, but if you're willing to understand that this is foundational to functioning democracy and thriving communities, call it what you want, but join us in helping to support the public's ability to, the ability to improve people's lives through news and information.
Although funding journalism is hard. As a funder, usually funders like control and they like understanding what the outcome of their actions will be. And funding journalists is like herding cats. They don't want to fill out impact reports. They don't want to fill out your bloody application form. They're not going to tell you what the impact of their work is going to be. They just feel that you should understand that you should innately support them. And I agree. But there's some language barriers and sort of communication things that we could help overcome. Are there any local journalists in the room? Because I'd love to hear what we can do better. No? Okay. Well, good to know.
That was quick.
Oh, there's one. There's one there.
Oh, there's one. Okay.
Just one. No. I look a bit at the numbers before coming. Actually, there is a huge demand in local to test new things, and we try to give, as ever, room for innovation, and we receive more than 300 projects about local and hyper-local, so not that reluctant to fill forms, because that's a templated application form, very in-depth. Great project. We awarded more than 50 projects, if you take the local plus the hyper-local, for more than 11 million euros in less than 2 years.
But you have a really good application form.
I mean,
yeah.
I don't know if we have, let's say, meaningful. Good, I don't know. And what is interesting is the topics they are working on. A lot about workflow, and that goes to cost reduction. A lot about fact-checking, a lot about data and maps, so gather data at local level.
Well, before you detail all of those different things, I think what's curious to me is that because we're talking about specifically funders and funders' own knowledge of what it is possible to fund, are you, for example, given that lots of funders have a lack of information about all of these different challenges, you're seeing it across a range of different, thousands of news organizations and so on. Are you sharing that information in different ways with peer funders they're then able to reduce their own costs of acquisition of that knowledge, if you like? So they've got better, you also have a pipeline. One of the things that is missing in the ecosystem is that collective sense among funders of where there are opportunities and where they should be placing their strategic interest in order to strengthen the environment. So how, that's a question to any of you really, but obviously to you mostly because you've got the biggest pool.
Actually, after 2 years where we make the decision on the project first on project, now we see the execution. So we are at a perfect time for knowledge sharing. And that's our big challenge and also our big commitment for this year. So we started to share much more now, and we're going to improve that a lot. And that's why also we try just to understand what does innovation mean. Talking about news in general, talking about local. So we came with categories, cluster, to try to define what's going on. And we are now trying to share much more through resources, use cases, impact demonstration, to share also what is done through our open source project, which is a huge opportunity for local as well. So yeah.
Thanks.
I mean, Samir, you know, and you are one of the people that, I mean, we've been trying to get funders to talk about funding journalism and how to improve our funding network and grow our funding network for a few years now. You're one of the protagonists of that, actually. Yes, you are. And I would very much like a one-on-one with Ludo. I think we should do that. Funders talking to the outcomes of the D&I pilot. Good idea.
Yeah. So I think there are a couple of examples in the U.S. One is there's a group called Media Impact Funders. Full disclosure, I'm on the board of that, and that is an organization that is specifically trying to foster more conversation among funders, and also to go find the other networks of funders, like the health funders, the arts funders, the environment funders, and talk about funding news and information in those spaces. The other model that I think is was a really brilliant strategy, and I'd love to see someone else pick it up if they could, was the Night Community Information Challenge that they ran for a decade, which was at its heart an initiative to get community and place-based foundations all across the U.S. I think they did some in Canada too, to fund local news and information. So Night gave grants to community and place-based foundations to re-grant into their local communities, and then they would bring them together. They still do actually bring them together every year for now it's called the Night. It used to be the Media Learning Seminar. Now it's the Night Media Funder Forum. Sorry, I can't remember. But, you know, the idea being bring everybody back together, talk about what they've learned at a local level, what's working, what's not working, get some, you know, sort of peer-to-peer help. But the idea there at its heart was very much like, how do we get more funders into this space? And I think, you know, it's a brilliant strategy, and, you know, anybody else who wants to pick up on it. Actually, there is a foundation in the U.S. called the Wincoat Foundation, who is sort of playing its part trying to take the baton from Night and do that a little bit as well, but they don't have the same resources that the Night Foundation does.
I'm glad you brought Night up, because I think that really, it's something that's curiously missing in lots of different places, that sort of sense of proceeding from the needs of communities into then, you know, driving all of the work from there, whether it's the foundations or the media organizations or whatever, I think. Let's open up to questions, because there are a lot of very, you know, there are faces I know in the room who are already incredibly informed and can ask better questions than I ever would. So are there questions right now? Okay, we've got two there.
Hi, my name is Nasser. I lead a team of Knight Foundation Fellows in India for the International Center for Journalists. We spend a lot of time trying to connect dots in the ecosystem about how, for example, we started a funders roundtable, informal, and Nishant's colleagues at Omidyar hosted us a while ago. My question is more about divorces between funders and the newsrooms they've been funding for a while, and at both ends of that spectrum. One, your experiences with newsrooms that you stopped funding because they were doing something wrong. What were they doing wrong? And the other, newsrooms that you stopped funding because they'd started doing something right and got to a point where they were more independent, less dependent on you, and what was it that they did right? Case studies, any of you could share, would be very good. Thanks.
And can we take the second question as well?
Hi, I'm Catherine Giles. I'm previously at Nesta, which is the UK's Innovation Foundation, which was the largest funder of hyperlocal media and community journalism in the UK up until about 18 months ago. I'm currently at an organisation called Digital Catapult, which is an organisation set up by UK government, but I'm soon to be starting with the EJC. So I guess it's more of a thought that I have around funding journalism is that, you know, potentially one of the difficulties is we can't just sort of cap funding media and journalism under the one umbrella, because there's so many different facets of it and so many different parts of how audiences want to engage with it. And certainly one thing that the UK government is doing, and not that government or sort of policy is particularly the be-all and end-all of sort of helping media and journalism. But there's, you know, a massive funding call at the moment around the audiences of the future. And that's, you know, something that creative industries as a whole can be looking at, where technology, so say particularly around immersive technology and journalism, that's obviously available for news organisations to apply to. So it's sort of more of a thought from the panel as well about what your thoughts are in terms of, you know, how we capture the whole ecosystem of the very technical side of journalism, and what government or policymakers' role could be in helping funding that, as much as then the very local and community and sort of social-based work as well.
Okay. Does somebody want to leap into some aspect of that? Do you want to start with divorces?
No, I think, so, no. I mean, some speak of a culture clash when it comes to clash, bringing people that are really good at technology together with journalists, and then being able to bridge some of the gaps that are there in terms of the work you do and the way you understand what you're doing. But I feel bringing people together is, and giving them the time and space, and sometimes even the money to develop projects together, is a great way to go about that. In terms of having governments involved, I'm personally not a big fan of that. There's a lobby in the Netherlands that says that, not a lobby, there's a couple of people in the Netherlands who say that, and they're prominent, so I'll call them a lobby, but who say that really local government and government should be funding local journalism because, you know, of the democratic deficit. And I'd really strongly say no to that. I wouldn't want government to ever, and I mean, there's plenty of examples now in Europe that show that that's not a good idea. Is that what you meant with involving government? Is it funding or is it collaboration?
No, I guess it's funding, but probably not so much on the local.
Oh, we have to wait for the mic. Can you stand up? I was doing interaction.
I'm being asked to stand up, so to be prominent. I guess my point was not so much about the collaboration, and probably not so much focused on local government funding, because in the UK as well, there's lots of propaganda issues in itself around sort of how local news is reported by local councils. But it's more around, like, if you've got these big government initiatives, what the opportunity is for journalism and news organisations to take an opportunity from those. So they may not necessarily be specifically like funding of journalism or media initiatives, but it could be something like this, Audiences of the Future, which news organisations could certainly take part of the pie.
Yeah.
And, you know, and I know more about what the UK government's doing, but yeah, I guess just thoughts about, you know, is that a wise step for international?
I mean, I certainly agree that it's a good place for UK organisations to go. I don't know, and I'm not sure exactly which initiatives you're referring to in the UK, whether it's the review around business models. Sorry?
Is it Cairncross? The Cairncross review?
Yeah, maybe you could be more specific on what you're referring to.
It's the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund,
right,
which is a massive, big, industrial strategy is a massive, big thing that the UK government have recently announced, and there's a lot of funding attached to that for specific innovations and challenge areas around technology. And the Audience of the Future is specifically around creative industry, so creative content, as well as immersive technology.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough, isn't it? I mean, ultimately, you want journalists to be journalists and kind of do their job in covering stories and in responding to you know, readers. Obviously, with the fundamentals of the industry changing, you need to get money from different places. But I would hate to see the basic premise of who journalists are accountable to change. And maybe that's what you were referring to with regards to local news. But I mean, you know, certainly as a funder, we really try and stay out of any editorial involvement in any of the independent media. Not we try, we do stay out of any editorial engagement. But there's a constant worry when we're being pitched during the course of the funding that organizations are orienting themselves towards what they think are our needs. And really, our needs are not what is important here. What is important is the needs of the community and of the audience and of democratic citizens. And we should be adapting to that, and we should be getting feedback from organizations on why we're not connected and why we have the wrong priorities.
That means we have to really organize that feedback ourselves, because there's a power disbalance, so we can't really expect organizations to come up to us and give feedback. I mean, that's the responsibility of any organization with power, is to organize your own feedback and to consistently do so.
That's why I'm mentioning it in public.
Yeah, I know. I wasn't against you, just elaborating on it.
Yeah, no, that point's really important. And I think the other thing I would add too is just you not only add those feedback loops in, but like just the consistency of, as a funder, making sure that you're consistently conveying a message that we want to hear about the good and the bad of what you're doing, and we're not going to punish you if you tell, we don't take a punitive approach. We can't help you if we don't understand what your real challenges are. But if you're sugarcoating it, we can't help you. But you have to consistently understand that you hold as a funder, you hold the power, and so you have to be very careful about being mindful of that and not being punitive in any way.
I wish I had more stories of successful divorce, of conscious uncoupling. But, we haven't had any successful exits yet from for-profit media deals. We hope that we will. On the non-profit side, there are also, very few organizations that have become so sustainable that we no longer need to fund them. But we've had, divorces for other reasons, in terms of what we feel like is the focus of the organization or the quality of the journalism.
Or for the kids.
Yes, all for the kids.
Although there are some very good examples of successful divorces, because you've got the Media Development Investment Fund. And for a very long time, they did quite well in terms of exits, but the geopolitical situation has changed.
But in a sense, I almost want to take your question and push it a bit further down the chain, in less when you're sort of consciously uncoupling, but when you're in the early stages of courtship, or I don't know, whatever the metaphor would be, that how do a lot of initiatives at the local level, and we talked a little bit about this earlier, they're very, very small initiatives, very micro, like you're sort of saying, 1-2 people working out of a bedroom, whatever. They're trying to do something, in South Africa. I was talking to somebody who was talking about an initiative that was run out of his car. He has a printer and a laptop plugged into a battery, and he's driving around, and that's his newspaper. It's sort of, when you're talking about that level, where somebody just is doing it out of sheer drive and passion, but they don't have the other bits, how are they going to go to the next level where they can go to an Omidyar, they can go to an SDM, they can go to, DNI or whoever, any funder, a local funder, a place-based funder, and have a cogent argument for why they should receive money and a way of absorbing it.
So our approach is very specific because we focus on project. And I love that you are talking about consistency. It's all about consistency. What we are doing is, again, give room for innovation and kickstart the project. So we are funding organization, companies, individual through their project, but not the overall operation of an entity, which kind of change everything. First, we are not investing. So we are here to kickstart. And then the funder, that's where the knowledge sharing is important as well. How the funder can kind of continue the project and move them to a next level, that can be a question, yeah.
I mean, I think philanthropy has an incredible privilege to be the one to provide the risk capital, and that we don't use that privilege nearly enough. I mean, that's sort of the tragedy of philanthropy, in my opinion. I thank you. And so, in that scenario that you laid out, Samir, where you have a guy who, clearly isn't established or proven in the eyes of a funder, what you described about the person is the passion and the drive. I think we all know, we can all cite lots of examples of people whose leadership, it just makes you, whose dedication and leadership makes you go, I'm going to take this leap of faith with you because I believe that you can get to the place that you say you want to get to, and we can provide you the runway and a little bit of space and stability to get there. And I think that should be the role of funders, and we don't do it enough. And I think that any of us funders who believe that should be saying it out loud more often so that we can get that in the air and try to convince our fellow colleagues that we need to take more risks. Now
So
is the
soon.
time to be bold.
For the record, we'd fund the guy in the car if it was a good idea. No problem.
And the great thing is he has transport to get to you. Corinne. Yeah.
Thank you, Corinne. John Crowley, I'm a journalist who worked for the first 5 years of my career in local journalism, and just going on from your point, Molly, where the funding from philanthropy is so strong in America, could you expand a little bit on why that is the case, and maybe for the Europeans in the room, why isn't that the case, and how have we perhaps failed as an industry on that front?
Okay, can we also take Corinne's question because she's been waiting to? If you want to start, then we can.
Sorry, I'm very short. Testing 1, 2. Great. Following on from that, it's really a request back to the panel. Sorry, I'm Corinne Podger. I've worked in international media development for the last 5 years, training journalists in developing countries. And it's a request back to the panel. It's not just that we need more funders. We need funders to understand the point that one of the panel members made about supporting independent journalism, right? So a lot of international funders of journalism do so with specific objectives, particularly around governance. And I think that's really a question of how can we have more conversations among funders, not just bringing more in, but having them understand that really one of the things that is at stake is independent journalism that's fundamental to democracy. And is there anything that our industry can do, not just the media development industry, but the journalism industry, to support those conversations?
To answer John's question, I guess what I would say is it's not as rosy a picture in the United States as it may seem over here. I understand that it's relative. You have big foundations like Knight, obviously, and Ford and MacArthur. But if you compare media funders to arts funders, education funders, there's no comparison, right? Again, I think a group like Media Impact Funders, those of us who are funding media and writing about it, it's on us to try to bring others into the space. One particular, and this sort of touches on Corinne's point as well, or question as well, is what are the ways in which we can make the case for that? The American Press Institute has a guide that's like best practices for funders, which specifically addresses not funding content and making sure that there is that editorial firewall. And then the other half of that guide it's for nonprofit newsrooms, but it's like, what are the best practices for accepting funding? Like, how do you build that relationship with funders, and what not to agree to with funders if they're pushing sort of questionable funding opportunities?
Yeah. I can recommend reading it. It's quite US focused, but there are efforts underway to try and adapt it also in a European context. Do you want to talk about?
Just about John's question about the EU and the US difference from a European funder's perspective. So I've been a funder for 3.5 years now, and I've been to quite a lot of meetings on sort of philanthropy organizing in Europe around journalism. And a really good one to mention here is the Journalism Funders Forum, which is initiated by the European Journalism Centre, where funders and journalists come together. And we had sort of a design thinking day a few months ago where we shared experiences, and in the beginning, of course, it's all very awkward and uncomfortable, but after a couple of hours of being in the same sweaty room, you do sort of get down to the nitty-gritty and become a bit more open and honest with each other. I'd like to do many more of those. Your question as to what sort of the industry's done wrong, do you mean the media industry or the philanthropy industry? Because I can talk about the other one. I mean, you did too well for a long time, so philanthropy never looked your way, never thought that they would be necessary. But as I sort of touched upon briefly before, most people in philanthropy are quite risk-averse and conservative, often have never worked in the field, and therefore it's a really big leap to fund journalism. If you're conservative and you like sort of controlling the outcome, journalism is not your sort of go-to area. Trust in journalism plays a part there too. So it takes a mindset change. And I think that all of us in this panel, I'm very happy to hear, are trying to create that mindset change in our colleagues. So I think we should just keep doing that.
So I want one closing statement from each of you, closing thought. Anything that's, I don't know, shifted for you, anything that you think, I'm going to go off and do right away. I'm going to commit 100 million of Pierre's money to... No, sorry.
Did that already.
Oh, sorry. Some of that was recycled money. So I don't know, I mean, are there things that you're practically thinking next, specifically in the domain of local news, that you want to close out with?
All right, I'll go first. I have a couple of things that I have been thinking about a lot in terms of newsroom culture shift and how we do reimagine the relationship between newsrooms and the public. And this sort of circles back to your original question about what the crisis is. And so the two things that I think really contribute to the crisis in trust is clinging to the view from nowhere, as Jay would put it. There is a clear middle ground between this notion that journalists are objective and don't have any biases whatsoever, which the public, by the way, thinks is complete BS. If you ask them, they will say that. There's a middle ground between that and, like, from a U.S. perspective, you know, Fox broadcast news, right? Like, there are, I've heard Eric Umansky of ProPublica talk about earned conclusions. You do the work as a journalist to understand what the facts are, what the context is, what the truth is, and you come to an earned conclusion. And so this concept of objectivity, I think, tends to be a very toxic part of moving forward. And then the other thing, really quickly, sorry, is just the pervasive and foolish lack of diversity in staffing of newsrooms, in sources, and therefore in the stories.
Thank you. Ludo?
So I'm going to use keyword to gain time. So innovation is key in local and in news overall, and redefining what is really the editorial value proposal at a local level when news, and mainstream news is becoming a commodity is absolutely necessary to find a recipe in terms of economics.
So that sounds like the theme for the next D&I round, perhaps. Who knows? Nienke.
I don't have a closing statement, Samir. I'm sorry. I'm going to not do one.
Okay.
Everybody's already said really relevant things. I think we're just going to keep on focusing on collaboration and infrastructure and feedback. So if you want to give me feedback later, go ahead.
I think, we're in, as the premise of the panel is that we're in a difficult time for local news. And I think that it's, my takeaway is sort of what Nienke said about taking risk and staying with the fight for a while. I don't think we're going to solve this problem in the next few years, unfortunately, together. I do think if we stay in the game for 10 to 20 years, we could find new avenues for making local news relevant again, sustainable again. And so, for me, taking more risk, as you said, and being truly patient, as Molly said, as philanthropists, is what I'm going to do going forward.
Thank you very much to this fantastic panel. Thank you all. Honestly, it's really great to have you all together.
Thanks again.
A round of applause. Thank you for coming.